The fact is that we can put it this way: an all-singing, all-dancing Mormon musical is a threat to nobody. Nobody thinks that Mormon mobs are going to go and kill anybody or threaten to. But there is a risk, and it is a legitimate risk in the world today, that an all-singing, all-dancing Muhammad musical in the West End...
One journalist walked into a studio stacked against him. 3 panelists, a video link, and a host pushing back. Douglas Murray came to say what nobody on British television says out loud: that Islam gets a protection no other religion gets. Watch him name the double standard in plain English. Watch the room try to talk around it. And watch what happens when the host finally asks a direct question about death threats. This is not a polite panel discussion. It is a demolition. Let's get into it.
Joining us for this discussion is Ajmal Mazrou, who just made that film. He's an imam and a member of the Muslim Council of Britain, and in the 2010 general election he stood for the Liberal Democrats in the London constituency of Bethnal Green and Bow. Welcome to you. I want to start with you, Mohammed. Muslims have chosen, in a way, to make a very big deal out of a pretty rubbish film, and it has been an overreaction, hasn't it?
There's no doubt it's a rubbish film, but this isn't film 2012. We're not here to critique the artistic quality of the film. What most people, and people I speak to on Twitter, people I speak to in the street and at meetings, one of the things they're very clear about is that they don't understand the context of the hate, of the pain, of the suffering that Muslims feel in response. Now, Muslims should never go beyond the limits and the boundaries of Islam in terms of peaceful protest and have it using...
Well, they've done it, haven't they?
Well, some have done it, and I think the question we should be asking is some, not all.
Yeah.
I've seen the film. It was not very funny. It was pretty disgusting. It was awful in some places. We do have a right to freedom of expression in this country. However, even the European Convention on Human Rights, in Article 10.2, sets limits on that freedom of expression, and it needs to be used responsibly, and it needs to be used in a measured sense.
Listen to what just happened. The host asks a simple question. Did Muslims overreact to a rubbish film? Mohammed Ansar agrees the film is rubbish, then pivots to pain, context and suffering. When the host points out that protesters crossed the line, the answer is some, not all. And then comes the tell. Article 10, Clause 2 of the European Convention. Barely a minute in, he is already reaching for a legal limit on speech. Douglas Murray is up next, and he does not accept the premise.
I mean, Douglas Murray, what's interesting is, it says that perhaps in the West we've lost any understanding of the depth of offence that things like this cause to Muslims, and is that a problem of our own making?
I think that's true in a way. Just quickly, I mean, the thing of saying Muslims, of course, in this, is that in most countries, there's a very small minority of people. I mean, and also we should bear in mind that a lot of political people are using this for their benefit. In Australia, the riots would seem to be led by, organisations like Hizb ut-Tahrir. In Britain, the very small number of protesters who came out seem to have been affiliated with groups like the now banned Al-Mujahirun and so on. So let's not think this is, as it were, Muslims as a bloc taking offence. But there is a correct perception, I think, that Islam as a religion is more brittle and feels these things more woundedly than other religions, and there is a reason for that.
Watch how carefully Murray sets that up. He refuses to treat Muslims as one bloc. In Australia, the riots were led by Hizb ut-Tahrir. In Britain, a handful of protesters from Al-Mujahirun, small organised outfits farming a grievance for their own gain. That is a more generous reading than anything else on this panel. And then he lands the line the room does not want. Islam is treated as more brittle than any other faith.
I mean, in a couple of weeks' time in London, the musical by the creators of South Park, Mormonism the Musical, will begin. It's been going on Broadway for some years, packed out crowds, including Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, who said she was so offended by this film on the internet. So one of the things about this is that most religions by now have realised that being satirised, being critiqued, being even ridiculed and criticised, let's face it, just criticised or looked at in a historical manner, as happened a few weeks ago with a film by Tom Holland on Channel 4. Even these things are felt very woundedly, and that's because all other religions, apart from Islam, have been through this period of criticism and have, as it were, come out to some extent, not completely, at the other end. Islam has not been used to this process historically. It is not used to the idea that your deepest feelings can be trodden upon, and that is a right that people who do not share your...
And there is the comparison that ends the argument. The Book of Mormon opens in London in a fortnight. It ran for years on Broadway to packed houses. Hillary Clinton sat in that audience applauding. the same Secretary of State who called this internet film deeply offensive. Nobody firebombed a theatre over it. Then Tom Holland makes a history documentary for Channel 4, and the death threats start arriving. Same country, same year, completely different rules. Ansar has heard enough, and he interrupts.
Douglas, what on earth are you talking about? Because how can Islam, which is a faith, it's a religion, it's an ideology, it's a way of life, you cannot talk about Islam in these broad, sweeping generalisations.
Well, you talked about Muslims
Islam doesn't feel things. Individual Muslims do, people who are mothers and fathers.
Can I get Ajmal?
If I could just
go ahead, Douglas,
quickly respond to that, because it is a very important point. There are lots of different strands of Islam, but in every Islamic society, and in the world today, and historically...
Do you mean Muslim majority?
No,
No. Islamic societies, societies that have Islam within the rule of law, countries like Pakistan where Islam is a very important part of the constitution and of the governance of the country. These places all put a particular emphasis on the fact that the ridiculing of the Prophet Muhammad or all sorts of claims about him, asking whether he existed and so on, is blasphemy. And that blasphemy...
Ansar's move is to attack the category. You cannot generalize about Islam, he says. Islam does not feel things. Individual Muslims do. Murray takes the objection and answers it with a map. Pakistan, where Islam is written into the constitution and into the governance of the country. Blasphemy law sitting on the statute book. That is not a sweeping generalization. That is a legal fact you can look up. Notice he never once attacks Muslims as people. He goes after states and laws.
punished.
I mean, Ajmal, it is an issue about those countries, isn't it? And it's all very well for you in the West to say, look, you can rise above it. But in Pakistan, in Yemen, in these places where there's been violence, they can't, can they?
I've got simply 3 points to make on this particular discussion. I think there's one correction for Douglas's information. Islam has been through 1400 years of critique, discussions and debates, internally and externally. And it has gone through it without a problem, and it will go through it without any issue. I have no issue with that. I think there is an element of truth in what we are saying here to do with Muslims' disproportionate response. The reasons these responses are particularly prominent in countries like Pakistan, Yemen, in Bangladesh, has more to do with politics than religion. Let me give you an example.
Very briefly.
Most of these countries are ruled by dictators and despots. Illegitimate governments, corruption is rampant, poverty is acute, no opportunities for people to make a better future for themselves tomorrow. And don't forget, the drones attack that has dominated Yemen and Pakistan has also exasperated frustration. So what we're now seeing is a political response using this as a pretext.
As an excuse.
But Prophet Muhammad, let me put it clearly, Prophet Muhammad doesn't need our defense.
Okay.
And God doesn't need our defense.
Ajmal Masoor comes in with 3 points, and one of them is genuinely strong. Dictators, corruption, poverty, drones over Yemen and Pakistan. All of that is fair, but listen to the first claim, because Murray is about to take it apart. Islam has been through 1400 years of critique, he says, and came through it without a problem. Hold that claim in your head for the next 60 seconds. The answer he gets is the best minute of this debate.
Absolutely. The second point you make, I think, is perfectly valid. The first, I think, is not. For this reason. You say that Islam has been through this process for 1400 years. A part of that is true. There has been debate within Islam, but on the fundamentals of Islam, about the nature of Muhammad, about whether or not he existed, even, whether the Quran was created by him or was created by God, whether he invented it, these things actually Islamic societies tended to, and Muslims even today, feel very brittle about. The fact is, and all singing...
Do you want me to name you scholars?
I could
let Douglas just finish, please.
Yes, and I could name them back, and many have suffered for raising these questions when they have. The fact is that we can put it this way: an all singing, all dancing Mormon musical is a threat to nobody. Nobody thinks that Mormon mobs are going to go and kill anybody or threaten to. But there is a risk, and it is a legitimate risk in the world today, that an all singing, all dancing Muhammad musical in the West End.
That is how you dismantle a claim. Murray concedes the political point immediately, then goes straight at the fundamentals. Debate inside Islam happens, yes. Debate about whether Muhammad existed, or who wrote the Quran does not. Masroor offers to name the scholars who did. Murray's reply is 1 sentence long. Many of them suffered for it. And then comes the line of the night. A Mormon musical threatens nobody. A Muhammad musical in the West End might not go off so well. Nobody in that studio disputes it, because they cannot.
Might not
but
go
you know,
off
Samira,
so
there is
well.
a very simple thing. If I keep insulting you, if I keep offending you, there is a limit to what I call freedom of speech. You cannot keep insulting me and offending me, I would turn around and say, Samira, your joke is not funny, please stop it. Eventually you'll stop. Do you know why? Because you respect me. You'd be kind and courteous to me. And
but this is about belief and not about individuals. I want to pause it there for a second.
A billion people are simply saying, what is wrong with accepting that we have the right to revere and follow our Prophet the way we do? But you have the right to criticize our religion, no problem. Be critical, but don't ridicule.
Watch the switch he makes. Masroor moves from religion to personal manners. If I keep insulting you, you would eventually ask me to stop. But a belief system is not a person. You cannot hurt the feelings of a doctrine. The host spots it instantly and says so on air. This is about belief, not individuals. And the answer still comes back the same. Criticize, but never ridicule. Who decides where criticism ends and ridicule begins? Nobody at that table will define it.
Let's bring in a couple of other contributors. We're joined by Miriam Francois Serra, who's a freelance journalist. You've been hearing the discussion here. I just wonder if we could go back to that point about how far it's politics picking up on an excuse to stir up trouble for their own ends. Is that what this is really about?
I certainly think when we're looking at the international dimension, we have to look at the places where the protests have been most violent, and they have been concentrated in countries which have recently experienced periods of upheaval, be they recent revolutions, be they wars. We spoke about drone attacks in Pakistan, in Yemen, where some of the most violent protests did occur. And so I think, if you like, I would interpret the film as being more of a focal point, which has allowed broader popular anger about a wide range of issues, including concerns about local government corruption, but also US intervention in the region and the impact that the American war on terror has had on many innocent civilians in the region. And so all of that anger and frustration which has been fermenting has expressed itself, and then it's become instrumentalized by various political parties, more or less extreme in the region, for their own ends, to destabilize local governments, to advance their own ends.
Miriam Francois Serra gives the most polished version of the deflection. The film is not really the cause. It is a focal point for anger about corruption, war, and American intervention. Notice what that argument does. It explains every riot, but never the trigger. The trigger is always a film or a cartoon. Poverty and drones are real. So is the question nobody here has answered. Why does this one insult produce this response, when nothing else does?
Thank you. I want to bring in A.B. Bowman, who's a stand-up comedian. Now, you've done comedy about Islam and Christianity. In fact, you performed Jesus the Guantanamo Years in Pakistan, I understand. What do you make of this idea that we can't ridicule Muslims? I mean, are Muslims too easily offended or not?
Well, my experience in Pakistan, and I think it's worth reminding your audience that Jesus is a prophet in Islam, so to depict him on stage, I should have, under the Taliban, would have been sort of beheaded for that. But my experience was that the audience in Pakistan were extraordinarily open to that, and I would agree with what your other commentators have said, that Islam is a much wider religion than just one. You know, there's 1.3 billion Muslims in the world, so even if there were 13 million rampaging, flag-burning suicide bombers, that would be 1% of Islam, and there's nowhere near 13 million. The number of suicide bombers is going down all the time.
The panelist joining via video link makes a fair point about numbers. 1.3 billion Muslims, and only a fraction ever take to the street. Nobody on this panel disputes that, least of all Murray, who said it first. But the numbers argument has a hole in it. You do not need 13 million people to stop a play. You need a credible threat and a nervous theatre manager. That is exactly the mechanism Murray described, and the room keeps talking around it.
Well, what do you think of the idea that, you know, we're somehow supposed to self-censor in case people choose to make political capital out of it? I mean, there's no connection between this film and drones, but it seems to be a reason given not to allow any films like this to be made or promoted.
Well, I would say that there is definitely a political context for this, and I think it's important to remember that particularly in Egypt and in Libya, where this kicked off, under the dictatorships of Gaddafi and Mubarak, the government controlled all media. So if something was in the newspaper, it's because the government said it was okay. So it's as if, you know, for a Western audience, you've been reading Hello magazine all your life, and then one day you picked up a copy of Hello and it said, President Barack Obama shows us around his lovely White House home, and then talks about his deep contempt for the Prophet Muhammad. You'd assume that he'd okayed that because that's what Hello magazine is, and that's the media people are used to. I do think that basically there's a sort of underlying point of anger against the West, against us for arming dictators and stealing oil and so on for a long time, and that can then be tipped over using religion as the touch paper to light that attack. I have to say I was hugely encouraged by the huge attacks yesterday on the militias who actually killed the ambassador, that so many Libyans actually rose up and said, this is not okay with us and we want you out.
That Hello Magazine analogy is genuinely clever, and it explains something real about state-controlled media. But look where it lands. The conclusion is still that the West is at fault. Religion is just the touchpaper. Benghazi is the interesting part. Libyans drove the militias out after the ambassador was killed. That is, ordinary people rejecting the violence, exactly the distinction Murray drew at the start. Now the host turns to Benjamin Lazarus. The question is blunt. Should we compromise?
Can I quickly bring in Benjamin Lazarus, who's a freelance journalist? It may be frustrating, but isn't it reasonable to say we know what happens when these kinds of films are made and promoted on the internet, and we need to compromise to avoid fueling more violence?
Absolutely not. That would be to cower in the face of sadomasochistic rage. And I think frustrating is perhaps a sort of obscurantist term. I think it would actually be abhorrent. We would sort of have to police society in a sort of Orwellian fashion, whereby bearded backwater clerics became the thought police and could monitor what elements of history we were permissible to study, what novels could be written, what we could watch on the internet, and so on.
Okay.
I don't see how that would be an acceptable situation whatsoever. And we should not be sort of intimidated by violence. And we went through the Enlightenment so that no single fanatical gang could enforce their will as the truth.
Benjamin.
So it'd be an awful submission now to accept Islam as the truth.
His answer is 2 words. Absolutely not. There is no hedging at all. Benjamin Lazarus refuses the premise exactly the way Murray refused it. Compromising here simply means cowering. And then comes the picture he paints. Clerics deciding which history can be studied, which novels can be written, what you can watch. That is not a slippery slope. That is what a heckler's veto actually delivers. We went through the Enlightenment for a reason. No gang gets to enforce its will as truth. Watch the host turn to Ansar next.
Mohammed Ansar, we're in this position, and Douglas mentioned it, where a scholarly documentary about the origins of Islam, is the maker of that, Tom Holland, is an academic, he's getting death threats. I looked at some of the comments he was getting on Twitter, really aggressive, from people who actually in sometimes quite important positions in the Islamic community in Britain. It has gone too far, hasn't it?
I'm a friend of Tom's. I've been very outspoken in the media and with Tom. They do this history festival, which is like a Glastonbury for history geeks.
But answer the question.
But his book was an academic discussion about the origins of Islam, and although I didn't like the information in it, it was roundly set upon by Muslim and non-Muslim academics across the world.
That's not entirely true. Do you accept the idea that death threats are completely wrong in this context?
Of course they are. Nobody sensible would condone that kind of behaviour. However, an academic discourse, as set out in Tom's book, was fine, as set out in his lectures are fine, but in the documentary, where he throws away any balance to the discussion and produces a very prejudicial and biased...
Count the moves in that answer. The host asks a direct question about death threats. The first answer is that he is a friend of Tom's. The second is a history festival, described as a Glastonbury for history. The host has to interrupt and demand an answer. Then the condemnation finally arrives. It lasts about 4 seconds before the however. However, the documentary threw away balance. However, it was prejudicial and biased. The death threats get 1 sentence. The criticism of the target gets 3.
In your opinion?
Glenn Bowersock, who was the head of history and classics at Harvard for something like 20 years, he's came out very, very strongly, and he's not Muslim, and he said this is shocking revisionism.
But it's the tone of the discussion.
I think the point about Tom Holland, he has the right to say what he wants to say. That's not a problem. Death threat is absolutely abhorrent. It's not Islamic. It's not befitting to be a good Muslim to say something like that. Absolutely. Forget about all of that. That's very simple. It's a human judgment on this issue. But the issue is, did Tom Holland do a good job of an objective program? I believe he didn't, number 1. Number 2 is just like the cartoonist who did new cartoons in France. We know from good sources that that newspaper was, or that magazine was financially struggling. Let's make a bit of money by putting up a cartoon that would sell a lot more.
Everyone's got an interest in stirring up trouble.
To be fair, that condemnation is clear. Death threats are abhorrent, not Islamic, not befitting a good Muslim. But he cannot leave it there. Straight back to whether Tom Holland did an objective job. Then, the French cartoonists get the same treatment. The magazine was struggling financially, so they printed it for the money. Everyone's got an interest in stirring up trouble. Everyone except the people making the threats. That is the pattern of this entire discussion.
I want to give Douglas the last word on this.
It comes down to a very fundamental point. Most people in this country are not Muslim, most people in France are not Muslim, and so on. We don't believe that Muhammad, if he existed, heard any angels speaking. It's the opinion of those of us who are not Muslim that he obviously either made it up or something else. Now, we think the same thing about Mormonism. Atheists obviously will believe the same thing about Jesus and about Moses and so on. But nobody has a problem saying, I'll make a film about Moses where he's made up the Ten Commandments. It was done very well by Mel Brooks. But nobody has a problem now watching a film saying that Jesus made it up. But they do have a problem, and we have a problem of censorship and self-censorship because people are afraid to say that Muhammad made it all up, and the response to that, they know, is that they will stop saying it, they will pretend and hope they won't get any trouble because they will pretend that they are sort of believing Islam. They'll say the Prophet Muhammad. They will.
And Murray closes it exactly where he opened it. Nobody flinches at a film saying Moses invented the commandments, Mel Brooks did it and it was funny. Nobody panics at a film about Jesus, but say the same about Muhammad, and people go quiet and start hedging. That is self-censorship, described from the inside. He walked into a hostile panel and left with the last word unanswered. And the story doesn't stop here.
Do you think this attack will underscore the message of the far right in Europe, at least, of the incompatibility of Islam and the West, or Western values?
That's a pretty atrocious question, if I may say so. We're about 24 hours away from 12 people being gunned down in a newspaper office in the centre of Paris, in a European city, because they offended, allegedly, Islamic blasphemy laws which France, Britain and other European countries do not have and do not believe in and do not follow. And for you to turn the question immediately, not on the people who've been massacred because of asserting their rights as European French citizens, but onto the alleged terrible discrimination of the French is really quite despicable.
24 hours after 12 people were shot. And the first question is about the far right. Murray refuses that frame on the spot. He calls the question atrocious, then explains exactly why. France has no blasphemy law. Britain has no blasphemy law either. Cartoonists were murdered over a law their country does not even have, and the opening instinct on air is to worry about the backlash. Watch the presenter try to reset the question.
So I didn't ask you anything about discrimination of the French. Let me repeat the question.
You went straight on to the alleged backlash.
Let me ask you the question again in case you didn't understand it. Do you think this attack, we are in our news bulletins talking in more detail about the actual attack. What you were invited to discuss in this show are the implications of what might follow the attack. Will it underscore the message of those who say there is an incompatibility between Western values and Muslim values?
The presenter says he never asked about discrimination against the French. Murray plays back the tape. You went straight to the alleged backlash. Then comes the line about not understanding the question. France abolished the crime of blasphemy in 1791. It has never come back. 12 people are dead on Rue Nicolas Appert in Paris. Charb, Cabou, Wolinski and Tignes are among them. Those are the facts on the table, and the question keeps circling back to Europe's far right instead.
No, you want to paint the narrative which you think turns immediately, not from the attackers, but on the French society, which you would like to portray. I'm giving you my answer, so why don't you listen to it? Which you would like to portray as somehow anti-Muslim or anti-Islamic or anything like this. Let's start from the fact that 12 people were massacred because European citizens asserted their right, which they have every right to do, to draw Muhammad just as they have the right to draw any other historical figure, which they believe in or don't believe in, it doesn't matter. They have that right. I don't think at this stage whether, a discussion of the far right in France or anything like that is really the point. The point is people were killed and gunned down for doing their job as journalists and cartoonists in a free society.
Okay.
In countries like Britain and France, most of us are not Muslims, and we do not believe in Muhammad as the founder of any faith that we follow. People are Christians, atheists, all sorts of things. You cannot expect, and this is the crucial thing, Muslims should not expect non-Muslims to abide by their own belief systems. You can yourself decide, you as a Muslim do not want to depict Muhammad, but the idea that is coming along in Europe at the moment is a growing idea that people who are not Muslims, who do not believe in Muhammad, who do not follow Islam, are also to be have to obey the rules of Islamic blasphemy. And in Europe at the moment, that is the big...
This is the argument the question keeps stepping around. You can decide not to depict Muhammad. You cannot impose that rule on non-Muslims. That is what the Danish cartoons crisis was about in 2005. It is why Theo van Gogh was murdered in Amsterdam. It is why Salman Rushdie spent years in hiding. It is why the Danish embassy in Damascus burned. Murray connects all of it to one principle. Wait until you hear what that whole argument earns him.
You've made that point, Douglas.
Sure. Unfortunately, if an impartial viewer were watching your program, they'd come away with the idea that all Germans and French people are nascent fascists waiting to expel Muslims. Actually, you just painted, for a journalist, it's quite shocking. You just painted a completely inaccurate portrait of what is going on in protests in Germany, which, in actual fact, if you look at it, are highly specific. Can I finish my point?
Let me correct you on a factual point. I didn't say all Germans or all French are looking to expel Muslims,
but then you decided
and I didn't mention a protest in any particular country. So now that we got the facts straight, please go ahead.
You made that point, Douglas. A fully argued case about blasphemy law waved off in 5 words. Then Murray objects to Germans and French people being painted as fascists in waiting. Can I finish my point? No. The correction is that no country was named. Meanwhile, Angela Merkel had already condemned the Dresden marches. Counter-demonstrators filled German city squares that same week. The gunman was still being hunted across northern France. That is the reality being flattened into one loaded question.
Your incredibly biased portrayal of European citizens starts from your misportrayal of people turning out at protests as being against all Muslims or wanting to expel them. And the presenter in Doha, sit in Doha. It really is astonishing. You are painting a picture of Europe which is outrageous. Across the Middle East, cartoons are published every day, every week, with the most disgusting anti-Semitic propaganda, the most disgusting propaganda in them. And you sit in Doha, a not free society, and smear Germans and French people a mere 24 hours after this.
This is the moment the temperature breaks. Murray points at the address Doha, a network based in a state with no free press, lecturing France on tolerance. He notes the cartoons printed across Middle Eastern papers every week. Charlie Hebdo mocked popes, rabbis, and politicians for decades. Nobody has shot up those other newsrooms. Qatar sat near the bottom of the World Press Freedom Index. Watch what he gets back instead of an answer.
I've just corrected you. You don't seem to be hearing these, so let me correct you again. Sorry, sir. I did not say the words all Germans or all French are against or calling for the expulsion of Muslims. That never came out my mouth. I said there are protests in which there have been protests by some in Europe, a minority, who are calling for exclusivity.
They're against Salafists. Do you not follow any details? The German protests are against Salafists.
I did not say all Germans. That is the defense, 24 hours after a massacre. Then Murray corrects the record on the ground. One of those German marches ran under the banner Hooligans Against Salafists. Another carried a lit cross through Dresden's Old Town. Cologne Cathedral switched off its lights as those marches passed. Charlie Hebdo had been firebombed once already, back in 2011. That is the primary problem Murray keeps pointing at. Fix it, and the secondary reaction never gets oxygen. Watch what that offer gets in return.
There is a problem in Europe, sir, and the problem is of Islamic fundamentalism. There is now also a secondary problem, which is that many people who do not like the Islamic fundamentalists are objecting to it. I suggest we unite in sorting out the first primary problem in order to also prevent the secondary problem from ever growing.
Okay.
But we have to portray this accurately.
Exactly.
And you as a journalist should be doing that.
We are doing that, and I thank you for your participation in this show.
It doesn't sound like it, and it's all very well
perhaps you could
for
then
Al Jazeera from Doha to do this, but really.
Do you believe that what has happened today is a fringe example of the behavior of a few Muslims, or do you in the far right, 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 or do you in the far right believe that this is an example of why Muslims are incompatible with European culture?
Listen to that question again. Or do you in the far right? 4 run-ups at the same phrase. Murray is an author and columnist, and the question hands him a label as its premise. Then it offers 2 doors, a fringe few, or a whole civilization declared incompatible. Charlie Hebdo had spent decades mocking popes and presidents alike. Nobody needed a clash of civilizations theory to explain Wednesday. Watch which door Murray refuses to walk through.
I will answer it because I'm a free person and a free European in a free society. And I can tell you that the primary problem is people who walk into offices and gun people down. There will be people in Europe, and I hope that they do not grow in number, who will object to that in a particularly unpleasant way. I hope that we all unite in stopping the fascist Islamists who turn up to offices and disgrace the name of their religion and attack people because of their right to freedom of speech. And I think that's what we need to focus on.
2 rooms, 2 decades of the same argument, and the same outcome. In the studio panel on the innocence of Muslims riots, Douglas Murray asked why a Mormon musical is fair game and a Muhammad musical is unthinkable, and nobody answered him. Ajmal Mansour's 1400 years claim collapsed the moment it was tested, and Mohammed Ansar needed asking twice before he would address the threats against Tom Holland. On Al Jazeera, Murray refused the far-right framing 3 separate times, and the presenter retreated into what he had and had not said. The substance never got touched. So tell us in the comments, when the argument goes unanswered, is that a win, or just a room that stopped listening?